Welcome to the Deep Dive. We unpack complex topics to get you well-informed, fast. Today, I want you to think about something quite provocative. What if many of the biggest global challenges we're grappling with now, huge economic inequality, the climate crisis getting worse, even conflict still raging, what if they all share a common root? A surprising one. We're diving deep into human colonialism today, and our guide is this really interesting source you shared with us, AI Decodes Colonialism, a scientific examination.
Yeah, and our goal here isn't just recounting historical events. It's more about trying to develop a kind of science, a framework, to really grasp colonialism in its entirety. We'll look at how it was justified, the nuts and bolts of how it worked, and importantly, its deep, lasting echoes in our world right now. Think of it like a diagnostic tool almost for understanding today's problems.
Exactly. We're going to unpack some key findings, try to bring some clarity to what can feel like a massive, tangled subject, hopefully offer you a powerful new lens to see the world. Let's get into it. Okay, so let's start with this kind of historical irony. For a long time, science was often used by empires as a tool. Now we're talking about a science of colonialism. How does that flip things? What does looking at it this way reveal?
That's a really vital distinction to make right at the start, because colonial science, that was knowledge created specifically for the empire. You had France, for example, back in the 1870s. They formally set up science colonials. Things like colonial geography, history, psychology, all geared towards making French rule more, efficient. Or Great Britain's African Research Survey. That was basically an intelligence project to gather data for economic policy. It was science designed to intervene, to classify, manage, and ultimately exploit. But what we're exploring today, the science of colonialism, that's different. It's not a hard science like physics, obviously. It's more of a modern analytical framework, an interdisciplinary effort trying to build a coherent, evidence-based way to study this in a field where interpretations often clash. So the shift from of to for is crucial science as a tool for understanding and deconstruction, not of domination.
Got it. That makes sense. So with that framework in mind, how do we tackle the big methodological hurdles, especially that tension between things you can measure, like economics, and the things you really can't, like human suffering?
Yeah, that's a central challenge, and it comes up a lot in discussions about reparations, for instance. Some approaches really zero in on the numbers, the econometric proofs. They focus on quantifiable things, loot, plunder, exploitation, trying to arrive at a sort of forensic calculation of damages, a precise figure. But a lot of historians push back against that. They argue quite strongly that focusing only on numbers misses the huge moral and psychological scars. It misses the sheer messiness, the contingency, the unintended consequences of it all. Reducing something so vast and complex just to figures might actually hide more than it reveals. So the real task is, how do you weave together the hard data of economic drain with the profound, unquantifiable impact on people, cultures, minds?
That sounds like a massive challenge. Now, our source brings in a really interesting way to think about this, using metaphors from logic, math, even physics, applying them conceptually to understand how imperial power worked internally.
Right, and it's important to stress these are metaphors, conceptual tools, not literal physics equations. But they help map colonialism's, let's say, internal forces. You've got its underlying logic, its quantifiable mathematics of taking wealth, and the dynamic physics of how power was used and resisted. So take the logic of coloniality. It worked from core assumptions, axioms really. Things like the colonizer's inherent superiority morally, intellectually, racially, and therefore the colonized people's inherent inferiority. From that starting point, the right, even the duty of the superior, to rule and exploit the inferior, followed almost like a logical deduction. It's a system that made even things like seizing land or crushing local cultures seem rational, necessary even. Then you have the mathematics of exploitation. This gives us the tools to actually quantify the drain of wealth. Right? Think about the Spanish crown's quinto real, a straight 20% tax on all precious metals mined in the Americas. This mathematical view shows a systematic, calculated extraction of wealth, often at a horrific human cost. And finally, the physics analogy gives us a dynamic view. Force is the obvious one: military power, political control, economic pressure. Like the Spanish conquests, inertia helps explain why colonial structures stick around even after independence. Legal systems, land ownership patterns, economic dependencies, they have this momentum that's incredibly hard to stop or change. And entropy, that's a useful way to think about divide and rule. Colonial powers often deliberately sowed discord, increased social fragmentation to stop colonized people from uniting against them. It was like injecting disorder into the system.
Wow. Yeah, these metaphors really do seem to push past simple stories. They offer a way to analyze the deep structure of how empire was thought about, justified, and actually put into practice. Okay, so we've touched on the practical application of power, but what about the ideas, the justifications? Let's unpack that sophisticated ideology they built to make domination seem legitimate, even necessary.
Right, because it wasn't just about guns and money. There was this whole elaborate ideological structure. It basically stood on three main pillars, all reinforcing each other. You had the civilizing mission, then a pseudo-scientific idea of racial hierarchy, and finally, a system of international law that wrote this hierarchy into legal fact.
Okay, maybe let's start with the philosophical and religious roots of that ideology.
Yeah, the cornerstone was the civilizing mission. The French called it mission civilisatrice. This was the core belief that Europeans had a moral obligation to bring their superior civilization, their reason, politics, morality, intellect, to so-called backward peoples. And this idea justified almost everything, from building railways to imposing forced labor. You have Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, really captured this paternalistic attitude. It painted non-white people as basically perpetual children who couldn't govern themselves. And Christianity was deeply entangled in this. It was often treated as synonymous with Western morality itself. Missionary work gave a theological green light for expansion, and it was often used quite deliberately to undermine and replace indigenous cultures and beliefs. This wasn't new either. It goes way back. Think 15th century papal bulls giving European monarchs a divine right to invade non-Christian lands, enslave people. And this whole concept got formalized incredibly at the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 85. European powers literally cited spreading Christianity and civilization as a key reason for carving up Africa.
So, the civilizing mission was the moral cover story. But they needed something that looked like objective proof, right? Which brings us to how they invented these racial hierarchies and tried to pass them off as science.
Exactly. That's where scientific racism comes in, a total pseudoscience from the 19th and 20th centuries. They used methods like craniometry, measuring skulls, and theories like polygenism, the idea that different races were actually different species. All of this was presented as hard evidence to prove that white Europeans were biologically superior. And this so-called proof was then used to justify slavery, kicking people off their land, subjugating them. And the eugenics movement, which is a really dark chapter, was tightly linked to this. Colonial territories became like giant laboratories for putting policies of extreme racial segregation and control into practice, all reinforcing these made-up hierarchies.
So you have the moral pretext, the scientific backing.
Right.
How did they make it legally binding? How did international law fit in?
That's maybe the most revealing part. International law, as it developed from the 15th century onwards, wasn't neutral. It was created by Europeans for Europeans, specifically to make colonialism easier and seem legitimate. It drew this fundamental line. Civilized European states had full sovereignty. Uncivilized non-European societies, they were denied sovereignty. They became mere objects of the law, things to be acted upon. The doctrine of discovery really crystallizes this. It got sort of codified for Africa at the Berlin Conference. Key parts were things like first discovery, basically. If a European nation found land unknown to other Europeans, they could claim it. And terra nullius, the legal fiction, that land was empty, even if indigenous people lived there, just because they didn't use it in a way Europeans recognized. And this doctrine explicitly linked claiming land to spreading Christianity and civilization. So you ended up with this really tight, self-justifying loop. The law was backed by the science of race, which provided the objective basis for the moral duty of the civilizing mission. It made the whole colonial project seem logical, moral, and perfectly legal.
Okay, we've laid out the ideology, the justification system. Now let's get really practical. How did empires actually establish and hold on to control? What were the nuts and bolts of applying power on the ground?
Right, well, colonial rule wasn't one size fits all. It definitely varied. We can sort of break it down into maybe three broad types. First, there's exploitation colonialism, sometimes called remote colonialism. Here you have a relatively small number of colonizers, and the main goal is just extracting resources to send back home to the metropole. Think British India or French Indochina. That's the classic model. Sure. Then you've got settler colonialism. This is very different. It involves large numbers of settlers moving in, permanently occupying the land. And the aim here is often quite brutal, to essentially destroy and replace the indigenous population, their culture, everything. The Americas, Australia, French Algeria, those are key examples. And third, there's internal colonialism. This happens within the borders of a state. A dominant group subjugates a group on the periphery, treating them like a colonized other inside their own country. People have talked about this in relation to U.S. urban ghettos, or very clearly with the Russian Empire's treatment of its serfs as a kind of internal colony.
That's a helpful way to categorize them. But even within those types, the strategies must have differed, right? How did different empires use their toolkit, so to speak?
Oh, absolutely. The methods were adapted constantly. Look at the British Empire in India. They were often quite pragmatic. Their divide and rule strategy was famous, deliberately playing on and worsening existing tensions, like between Hindus and Muslims or between different castes, to keep people from uniting. After the Big Sepoy Mutiny in 1857, they clamped down, brought in direct crown control, and used colonial education to create this anglicized middle class that would, theoretically, be loyal. The French Empire, though, often went for more direct rule and assimilation. Driven by that mission civilizatrice idea, they actively tried to dismantle traditional structures and replace them with French ones. And they used divide and conquer, too, sometimes in really manipulative ways, like using ethnography to invent divisions. The Kabylie legend in Algeria was an attempt to split potential nationalist movements. So while the approaches differed, British pragmatism versus French assimilationism, maybe there's a common theme. Colonialism wasn't just brute force. It involved careful study, analysis, finding societal weak points. Divide and rule wasn't just a tactic. It was almost a universal technology of imperial control.
And underlying all these strategies, all this control, was the main goal: economic exploitation.
Yes, fundamentally. The entire economic setup was engineered for a one-way street of wealth flowing out. The concept of the drain of wealth from British India, which Data Pinorji highlighted, shows this starkly. You had exploitative land taxes, the deliberate destruction of India's own industries like textiles, to force India to buy British goods. This wasn't just unfair, it had horrific consequences. It led to terrible famines, maybe 28 million deaths between 1850 and 1900, partly because land was used for cash crops for export, not food for locals. And you see similar patterns everywhere, whether it's Britain deindustrializing India or Spain's Quinto Real sucking silver and gold out of the Americas. The basic math of extraction was the same, and this systematic drain didn't just reshape the colonized world, it profoundly shaped Europe too. Interestingly, it led to stagnation for some colonial powers, like Spain maybe, while it fueled industrial revolution in others like Britain. Look at the Dutch monarchy, the House of Orange and Nassau. Research suggests they pulled in at least $545 million in today's money from their colonies between 1675 and 1770. That was roughly half their total income. So colonialism created this huge economic gap, not just between colonizer and colonized, but even between the European powers themselves, depending on how they managed that extracted wealth.
That's quite a paradox, and it really underscores your point that just because formal colonial rule ended, the impact certainly didn't vanish. These echoes are still very much with us.
Absolutely. The legacies are profound, and you can see them everywhere. Look at the physical landscape. Colonial infrastructure, the railways, the ports, the roads, they weren't built for the benefit of local people or local economies. They were built for extraction. The shortest, cheapest route to get resources from the mine or the plantation to a ship heading for Europe. This created what economists call path dependency. It locked post-colonial countries into patterns that were hard to break. And the result today? Crippling infrastructure deficits across much of the global south. It's estimated that poor infrastructure cuts Africa's economic growth by about 2% every single year. And then there's the environmental damage. Colonialism was a huge driver of deforestation globally. Forests cleared for timber, for massive single-crop plantations, for mining. This ecological imperialism was often enabled by pushing indigenous people off their land, ignoring their knowledge, and using legal fictions like terra nullius to declare the land empty. And this isn't just history. It's created lasting environmental injustice. Marginalized communities, often the descendants of those displaced, are still bearing the brunt of pollution and environmental degradation today. And linking this to the biggest crisis we face now, the IPCC, the big international climate body, now officially recognizes colonialism as a root cause of the climate crisis. Think about it. The Industrial Revolution, when we started burning fossil fuels on a massive scale, was financed by wealth extracted from colonies and relied on resources taken from them. The global north is responsible for something like 92% of all the excess carbon emissions historically, and this creates new problems like climate colonialism or green colonialism. This is where modern climate solutions, things like carbon offset projects, can actually end up repeating old power dynamics. Northern countries keep polluting, pay for projects somewhere in the south, which might then displace local communities from their land.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, how these patterns just keep repeating. That analogy you mentioned, 19th century railways built to extract minerals, paralleling 21st century digital networks built to extract data. Digital colonialism. The commodity changes minerals then, data now, but the basic power imbalance, the logic of extraction, seems stubbornly persistent. Okay, let's shift from the land to the people. What about the scars colonialism left on bodies, on minds?
Oh, the impact there was just as deep, if not deeper. And it touched everything. Take global health. The massive inequalities we see today have deep roots in the colonial past. Colonial medical systems weren't primarily about the health of the local population. They were mostly about protecting the Europeans living there and keeping the local workforce productive enough to, well, work. So after independence, many countries inherited these really weak, fragmented healthcare systems, often heavily dependent on foreign aid and at the mercy of Western pharmaceutical companies. And we shouldn't forget the history of unethical medical experiments conducted on colonized people. That's a very dark precedent. Colonialism also actively constructed and enforced social hierarchies. The whole modern concept of race as a biological thing was largely hammered out during this period, precisely to justify exploitation, placing whiteness at the top to legitimize slavery and other forms of domination. Then gender. European colonizers brought their own patriarchal ideas and imposed them, often disrupting more balanced or fluid indigenous gender systems. They systematically undermined women's power, for example, by taking away traditional land rights and sexuality. Colonial powers imposed their Judeo-Christian morality through laws. They criminalized things that didn't fit their norms, like same-sex relations or non-binary gender expressions. And tragically, the legacy of those colonial-era laws is still visible today in many post-colonial countries that continue to criminalize LGBTQ+ people. And maybe the most insidious legacy is psychological. Frantz Fanon, the psychiatrist from Martinique, wrote powerfully about this. He argued colonialism wasn't just external oppression, it inflicted deep internal wounds. Things like internalized racism, where the colonized person comes to believe in their own inferiority, a fractured sense of self, alienation from one's own culture. This leads to what's sometimes called the colonial mentality, this deep-seated belief in the colonizer's superiority, which can result in self-hatred, rejecting one's own heritage, trying desperately to assimilate. This trauma doesn't just affect one generation, it gets passed down, creating ongoing identity crises and mental health burdens.
That paints a very stark, very heavy picture. Which brings us, I suppose, to the idea of the unfinished business of decolonization. What does that really mean today?
It's a crucial concept, because gaining political independence, which itself was often incredibly violent, think of the Mau uprising in Kenya, the Algerian War, that wasn't the end of the story. Often, formal colonialism was just replaced by neocolonialism. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president, defined this really well. He said, a neocolonial state is independent in theory, but in reality its economy and its policies are directed from outside. This happens through economic leverage, conditional foreign aid, the power of multinational corporations, international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank imposing policies. It keeps former colonies locked in cycles of debt and dependency. So, true decolonization isn't just about flags and anthems. It means actively undoing colonialism in all its forms, culturally, psychologically, economically. There's the idea of decolonizing the mind, which means dismantling those internalized colonial attitudes we just talked about. Some thinkers advocate for delinking, consciously breaking away from the dominant global economic and political system, which is still shaped by colonial legacies, and instead centering alternative ways of knowing and being, often drawing on indigenous knowledge systems, focusing on things like collective well-being, the concept of buen vivir in Latin America, for example, rather than endless growth and extraction. And you see this in action in cultural revitalization movements. These aren't just about nostalgia. They're deeply political acts. Look at the revival of Te Reo Maori, the Maori language in New Zealand. Through community efforts like language nests and now government support, it's about reclaiming identity and cultural sovereignty. Or the Sami people in Northern Europe. They've established Sami parliaments to assert their rights, and they're actively fighting what they call green colonialism, new mining projects or wind farms pushed onto their traditional lands in the name of green energy, but without their consent.
These efforts really highlight the ongoing struggles, and that naturally leads to the global conversations happening right now about accountability, reparations, reconciliation. How does that fit into this picture?
It's central to the unfinished business. The moral argument for reparations is pretty straightforward. Western wealth was significantly built on the backs of enslaved people and through exploiting colonial resources. Just one figure. In 1860, enslaved people in the U.S. were valued at something like $3 billion. That's an astronomical sum then. Their descendants never received compensation for that stolen labor and capital. So proponents argue reparations which could take many forms. Financial payments, yes, but also investments in health, education. Official apologies are necessary to address the lasting damage. Of course, there's opposition. Arguments like, well, no one alive today was directly responsible, or would be too divisive, or just practically impossible to figure out who gets what. And legally, it is tricky. International law has this intertemporal principle, which basically means you judge past actions by the laws of that time. And under the European-made law of the colonial era, many of these atrocities weren't technically illegal. So the reparations movement often leans more heavily on moral, ethical, and political grounds, rather than purely legal ones. But there are models for seeking justice and healing. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, TRCs, have been used in places like South Africa after apartheid, or Canada regarding the Indian residential schools. They aim to establish a historical record, give victims a platform, and make recommendations. There's also restorative justice, which focuses less on punishment and more on repairing harm through dialogue between those affected. This often draws on indigenous traditions like Native American sentencing circles. And we're seeing pressure on modern institutions too. Monarchies, like the Dutch royal family, are facing calls to acknowledge the colonial sources of their wealth. Museums are huge battlegrounds over the restitution of artifacts looted during the colonial era. We've seen successes, like Germany returning hundreds of Benin bronzes to Nigeria, but also ongoing disputes like the Parthenon marbles. These are really potent symbols of grappling with the past.
It does seem like there's this emerging, maybe unofficial, three-pronged approach. Truth through these commissions, treasure, getting artifacts back, and transformation through restorative justice trying to heal relationships.
That's a good way to put it. So pulling it all together, this idea of a science of human colonialism, it really functions like a diagnostic tool.
Yeah.
It helps us connect the symptoms we see today, global inequality, racial tensions, conflicts, the climate emergency, to their deep historical roots in imperial domination. It pushes us beyond simplistic explanations. It gives us a framework to diagnose inequality by tracing it back to that drain of wealth, those extractive systems. It diagnoses racial injustice by showing how race itself was constructed as a tool for power. It helps diagnose conflict by revealing the legacy of divide and rule. And it diagnoses the climate crisis by identifying colonialism as a key historical engine of emissions and ecological damage.
And having that diagnosis has real practical implications for all of us, for you listening. It equips you to think differently about who you vote for. Are they committed to real sovereignty or just maintaining old dependencies? It helps you understand the demands for climate justice, for climate reparations, as rooted in this history. It gives you a lens to understand cultural conflicts that goes beyond simplistic narratives of ancient hatreds.
Absolutely. And if there's one primary recommendation that comes out of analyzing colonialism this way, it's the urgent need for a comprehensive decolonization of education at every level. For centuries, education systems were tools of colonial power. They imposed European ways of thinking, erased indigenous histories, languages, knowledge systems. So decolonizing education means fundamentally rewriting curricula. It means bringing in diverse perspectives, centering those marginalized histories and languages, teaching colonialism critically, not as some benign historical episode. This is absolutely essential for what Fanon called decolonizing the mind, equipping the next generations to actually see and challenge the colonial structures that still persist.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. As you go about your day-to-day, just notice things. What unseen colonial echoes might you be bumping up against, maybe in your workplace, your community, the media you consume? And how might using this kind of diagnostic science we've talked about inspire you, maybe even in a small way, to take a step towards decolonization in your own life?
This is DigitView.